Hi, welcome to this episode of The Daily. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, the other night I watched the new documentary that's on Netflix called Tony Robbins, I Am Not Your Guru, and it's about self-help guru Tony Robbins. The title is actually quite disingenuous because in actual fact, even though he says, and the title comes from this moment in the seminar, he says, I'm not your guru, he really is a guru. He's got a system and a methodology. He works with people to try and help them overcome their problems. He even, during his seminar, tells them what he thinks the meaning of life is. So, I mean, by all accounts, he really does fit the definition of a guru, so it's kind of a bit disingenuous. The interesting thing about Tony Robbins and about this whole documentary is that he has latched onto some fundamental truths, I think, and he does present some important truths about the human person and personal development. So, for example, he's not a charlatan. He's not someone who's just making stuff up and trying to sell you snake oil. So, for example, a lot of people do wrongly attribute the problems in their life to things that are beyond their control, or a lot of people allow themselves to get stuck in behaviour patterns or habits or ways of thinking, and they think that it's all being done to them, and they just refuse to take responsibility for that. And that's one of the things where I think Tony Robbins is really strong in helping people to see that in actual fact there are a lot of things in your life that you can take charge of, and if you really want to fight for some sort of change, you will fight for it. And he has a lot of practical insights that help in that regard. However, mixed in with that, there are also a lot of what I think are problematic things. And the methodology that he uses, I think, is prone to manipulation, and that's where I think the problem really arises. So on the one hand, he does good things, like he has a team of leaders who, and they keep a special eye on people who might be candidates for suicide, for example, because they might have revealed to them in their forms they fill out prior to participating in his 6-day seminar that they have actually attempted suicide, and so they actually assign leaders to keep an eye on those people and work with them throughout the 6 days because it can get quite emotional. And you've got to respect that. There's a level of concern and care for the people who are coming through his particular system that I think is reflected in that sort of approach. However, once he's actually engaged in the seminar, you've got people, there's a lot of emotive music used and played in the seminar, which tends to lead people towards emotionalism and euphoria. It doesn't necessarily help people to go deeper. It tends to just lead them towards emotionalism and euphoria. I found that for me personally, a lot of the big breakthroughs in my life that really mean something have come away from all that sort of emotionalism. The other thing too is that the way he talks to people, he uses really abusive, obscene language, and he explains in this documentary that he does it because you have to shock people out of their way of thinking sometimes, and using the F word and calling them names actually shocks them out of certain thought patterns. Well, kind of, but if you are doing it all the time, like the whole time, is you're just dropping F-bombs, it's not really shocking anymore because you're doing it the whole time. It loses its shock factor pretty quickly. And I also question how someone is supposed to process this once they get away from the seminar. So if you've stood there, as he does in this documentary, and calls someone names and accuses them of being this, that, and everything else as a shock technique to try and get them to a place of healing, when they're away from the seminar, when they're away from all the emotionalism, and they start processing things, do they go back to that moment and say, yeah, that's true, I am one of those things, and that's all they reflect on and all they obsess on? Isn't it possible that there's actually a lot of potential damage here? I think there are other things too about the way that he operates that do present serious problems around, they effectively manipulating people to try and get them to where you want them to be. Now, he would probably argue, look, I'm trying to get them to this really good outcome, so the end justifies the means. But I would say, no, that's not acceptable because A, it's unethical, I think, to treat people in that way, to manipulate people fails to show respect for their human dignity, and B, I think it's actually quite risky. They aren't just counters that you move around a game board to get them to where you want to go, even if you think that you're giving them a really good outcome. They have a fundamental human dignity that I think is worthy of respect and worthy of a proper and safer, a much safer kind of care, because with manipulation comes great risk as well. So I think, it's an interesting documentary. I would use the word documentary loosely though, because the one thing that I found probably most frustrating about this documentary is that it's really more of a promotional film, and reading about some of the backstory, it kind of makes sense now when you discover that the director, Joe Berlinger, who's actually produced probing documentary material before, was actually someone who went along to a Tony Robbins seminar and was really impacted by it, and then he suggested that they should make a documentary. So it really is more of a promotional vehicle, whereas a good documentary sort of starts from, even if it's from a point of advocacy, it's trying to really probe and go deeply. And it tends to be a lot more open than what this is. You know, at the end of this, I sort of felt like I'd never quite met or understood or really got to see the real Tony Robbins. It still didn't feel that way. This felt very much like a promotional vehicle for Tony Robbins, like you were encountering and meeting and hearing about the Tony Robbins who wants to sell you something, or the Tony Robbins who wants to convince you to come to one of his seminars. It still didn't quite feel like you got to meet the real guy and to probe a lot more deeply. And I think a good documentary would have really probed and asked some of those key questions. It just felt like that they stopped at that point because it really was more of a promotional vehicle. It's worth a watch, if for no other reason than to sort of getting more of an insight into how Tony Robbins actually operates when he runs one of his seminars. But as I said, there's things I think about his methodology that are good, and there are things that I think are questionable and problematic. And the documentary overall, it just didn't quite go deep enough for me. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily.